There is a habit so embedded in our lives, so steady in its presence, that it often goes unnoticed. It doesn't need a loud voice, visible movement, or even physical participation to leave a noticeable imprint. It slips beneath awareness, running quietly beneath the surface, yet pulling on your energy like an unseen undertow. This activity is not some grand event or harmful behavior. It is the constant flood of thoughts, the endless spinning of the mental wheel that has been mistaken for productivity, awareness, and intelligence. It's been glorified as insight, praised as depth, and disguised as consciousness. But in truth, when left unchecked, it drains the system silently. People rarely see the toll that this inner dialogue takes. They go about their days unaware that the fatigue they feel, the disorientation that sets in, or the struggle to stay rooted in the moment might not be from external stress, but from the relentless, unfiltered stream of internal chatter. Not all thinking is harmful. In fact, thinking, at its core, is a function of survival, creativity, and understanding. But thought without awareness mutates into something heavier. It becomes a whirlwind, not of solutions, but of assumptions, replays, speculations, and fear-driven loops that gnaw at inner stability. The mind, when not directed, doesn't pause. It fills every open space with projection. It tries to solve problems that don't exist, rehearse conversations that will never happen, and prepare for disasters that will likely never unfold. This continuous stream doesn't just distract, it fragments. It distorts the lens through which reality is perceived. Before long, you are not living your life. You are reacting to interpretations. And while this may sound subtle, the consequences are far-reaching. Your internal state does not remain isolated. It informs how your energy circulates, how your body feels, how your nervous system responds, and how the world reflects back to you. Every thought carries a tone, a weight, a frequency, and as this frequency compounds, it becomes an environmental influence, not around you, but inside you. This invisible atmosphere begins to shape your responses, choices, and interactions long before you even notice. This energetic distortion doesn't always show up as panic or crisis. Often it presents as a fog, a numbness, a quiet sense that something isn't quite aligned, though it's hard to name. You find yourself yearning for clarity, reaching for peace, but continuing to entertain the very process that keeps both at bay. That's the silent paradox of overthinking. It gives the illusion of control while secretly causing chaos. Many people believe that their mental activity is a reflection of their awareness. They assume that thinking more means understanding more. But excessive mental noise doesn't enhance perception. It smothers it. You don't gain insight by constantly spinning stories in your head. You gain insight by noticing when the stories begin and choosing whether or not to follow them. The mind is not inherently harmful. It was designed as a tool, sharp, precise, and capable of extraordinary complexity. But like any tool, when misused, it becomes dangerous. When the tool becomes the master, the system begins to malfunction. The very function that once helped you navigate life now pulls you out of it. Thoughts become sticky. They loop. They grow louder with repetition. And in time, what began as a moment of reflection becomes an identity. You no longer have thoughts, you become them. You begin to believe that your fears define you, that your doubts are facts, that your worries are warnings. And once you adopt these inner movements as truths, you stop questioning their origin. You forget that the mind operates largely through habit, not choice. Most of what runs through your mental space isn't new. It's recycled, echoes of old memories, old interpretations, old conclusions that never got questioned. The mind doesn't need something real to create tension. It will use the past, the future, or pure imagination to create pressure. It will remind you of things you did wrong, scenarios that might go wrong, and versions of yourself that feel incomplete. This non-stop activity begins to shape the energy you emit. You are not just surrounded by energy, you are constantly generating it. That generation is not random. It's informed by how you think, feel, and interpret. And when that energy becomes heavy with repetition and fear, it starts to color your world. You may find yourself attracting experiences that feel strangely familiar. You leave one environment, enter another, and yet the same emotional patterns resurface. The same unease, the same conflicts, the same misalignments. And you wonder, why does this keep happening? The answer isn't always found in what's happening around you, but in what you continue to replay within. When you think the same things over and over, you are essentially rehearsing an energetic script. That script sends signals, subtle but consistent, and those signals begin to shape your path, not because of destiny or misfortune, but because of resonance. You emit what you maintain. You magnetize what mirrors your vibration. Most people try to shift this by thinking harder. They analyze their emotions, dissect their behaviors, and try to map their patterns with more thinking. But analysis doesn't dissolve mental congestion. If anything, it thickens it. Insight doesn't come from overexertion. It arises when there is space. Mental space, emotional space, and energetic space. This space cannot exist while thought occupies every corner. And that's why internal clarity begins not with effort but with observation. Noticing, not fixing, is the beginning of release. When you start to recognize the momentum of your thoughts, you interrupt their control. You introduce a different quality to your inner environment. A pause, a breath, a witness. But witnessing is not the same as judging. Observation means watching the thought arise without grabbing it, without feeding it, without turning it into an identity. It means letting it pass without acting as though it holds ultimate truth. This simple shift from entanglement to neutrality begins to restore the natural rhythm of your energy. Every thought leaves a trace, especially the ones you don't question. When repeated enough, they don't just live in your mind, they settle into your system. You feel them in your posture, your breath, your mood. They become the background hum that plays beneath your every interaction. And even when you're not consciously aware of them, your energy carries them forward. This is why emotional weight often lingers even when nothing appears wrong. You can be sitting in a quiet room, surrounded by peace, and still feel tense. Because peace isn't about the absence of noise outside, it's about the absence of unresolved tension inside. And much of that tension originates from the repetition of unchecked thought. The brain doesn't distinguish between what is happening and what is imagined. If you replay a painful memory, your body responds as if it's happening now. If you picture a terrifying future, your nervous system braces itself. And if you keep doing this, your energy begins to reflect a life that isn't real. You're not responding to the moment, you're reacting to internal echoes. It's easy to underestimate the power of a single thought. But just one repeated idea, if left unchallenged, can begin to shape how you see yourself, others, and life as a whole. And when that idea becomes a pattern, it starts behaving like a program, running in the background and influencing everything it touches. Not all of this programming originates with you. Much of what plays inside the mind is inherited, absorbed from parents, culture, community, or shared fears. It's entirely possible to carry thoughts that aren't truly yours, but feel so familiar, so embedded, that they seem to be. These mental relics, passed down through generations or absorbed from the collective, still affect your energy as if they were chosen. So the real work isn't to force the mind into silence. That only creates resistance. The work is to create a new relationship with it, one where thinking is no longer confused with being, where thoughts can arise, be seen and move on, where the mind is returned to its role as a tool, not the ruler. When this new dynamic begins to settle in, something changes. You feel more room inside, your reactions slow down, your body softens, the internal grip begins to loosen, and you start to realize how much energy was being used to manage a chaos that didn't need to exist. This doesn't mean you stop having thoughts. It means they stop having you. They stop running the show. They stop dictating your emotional landscape. And this change doesn't come from resistance. It comes from familiarity with a different state, a quieter state, a clearer state, a more spacious state. At first, that space can feel foreign. You might even mistake it for emptiness or boredom. But that's only because you've been conditioned to equate stimulation with meaning. True peace often feels unfamiliar in the beginning, not because it's wrong, but because it's rare. But once you get a taste of it, once your system experiences the contrast between noise and stillness, you begin to crave it, not as an escape, but as a return. This return is not about withdrawing from life. It's about re-entering it with presence. It's about showing up without dragging along the weight of every thought you've ever had. It's about experiencing what is actually happening instead of endlessly interpreting it. When you live in this way, energy flows differently. It doesn't mean your life becomes perfect or problems vanish. It means your responses become cleaner, your perceptions sharper, and your vibration steadier. You're no longer vibrating from old wounds or imagined threats. You're moving from clarity. This level of clarity doesn't demand perfection. It asks for honesty. Honesty about what you're carrying, what you're replaying, and what you're ready to release. And that honesty, when practiced gently, begins to clear the noise. It begins to return you to yourself, not the self made of thoughts and labels, but the self that exists beneath them. That is where real change begins, not in rearranging the content of the mind, but in stepping back far enough to see that you are not the content. You are the container, and that container, when no longer filled with clutter, becomes a space of clarity, vitality, and flow. There's something subtle that occurs when you start to disentangle from the constant chatter within. It's not loud. It doesn't announce itself with a dramatic shift, but it's profound. As you begin to observe rather than participate in the flow of mental activity, your inner system starts to settle into a different rhythm, one that doesn't depend on tension, urgency, or incessant judgment. This rhythm, more natural and stable, doesn't come from thinking differently. It comes from realizing how deeply you've been thinking without awareness. You may notice at first how many of your thoughts are actually recycled echoes. There are loops that play not because they're needed, but simply because they've been playing for years. The same doubts, the same projections, the same stories about who you are and how the world works. These loops aren't kept alive by logic. They're kept alive by habit. They exist because they've never been fully questioned, never truly examined. And because of that, they have taken root not just in the mind, but in the way your entire field organizes itself. This field, your personal energetic environment, is sensitive. It reacts not only to what you say and do, but to what you allow to persist beneath the surface. And when you have countless thoughts running in the background, the field starts to reflect the chaos. You may not see it, but you feel it. That feeling of being overwhelmed for no reason, that inability to relax even in quiet settings, that tension that lives in your shoulders, your breath, your chest, your spine. It's not caused by the world, it's caused by the unresolved storms inside. And these inner storms don't begin with big events. They begin with the refusal to pause, to check in, to examine. The mind becomes a runaway train, convinced it must keep moving to stay ahead of life. But life isn't chasing you. It's waiting for you to return. And you can't return when you're always racing somewhere internally, You've likely had moments, fleeting, brief, unplanned, where something within you grew quiet. Maybe it was while looking out a window without thinking, or sitting in a car before starting the engine, or standing in the shower as the water hit your skin. In those brief instances, without trying, something let go, and suddenly there was a feeling that wasn't empty but full, not busy but alive. Those moments are not accidents. They are your baseline. The noise is the interruption. The stillness is your origin. But most people don't know how to stay there. They notice it briefly and then the mental voice returns, commenting, analyzing, preparing. The habit of thinking has become so automatic that silence feels awkward. But silence is not a void. It is a reset. And the more you invite it, the more you remember what it feels like to actually inhabit your own presence without commentary. The key is not in fighting the thoughts, that only strengthens them. The mind feeds on resistance. The moment you decide to force it into submission, it reacts, it multiplies, it rebels. That's why techniques that aim to eliminate thinking often backfire. They create another mental task, another pressure point. The way out is not through control, it's through conscious disengagement, a gentle stepping back, a soft inner repositioning. You don't need to stop the thoughts. You just need to stop mistaking them for truth. And as you do, your inner environment begins to shift, slowly at first, but noticeably. You might find your breath becoming deeper, your reactions less immediate. Your need to explain, defend, or fix starts to dissolve. It's not that you've become passive, it's that you've stopped living in reaction. You've stopped making every thought a trigger. You've stopped giving every mental image the power to define the moment. This kind of shift changes how energy moves through you. Where there was once contraction, there's now space. Where there was urgency, there's now openness. And in that openness, other aspects of yourself that had been overshadowed by thought begin to emerge. Intuition, creativity, clarity. The ability to perceive what's actually happening rather than what your mind says is happening. Most people have no idea how distorted their perception becomes under the weight of thought. When the mind is in overdrive, it doesn't just narrate, it rewrites reality. It adds layers of fear, assumptions, projections, and filters. You don't see people as they are. You see them through the lens of past pain. You don't see moments as neutral. You see them as dangerous or disappointing or not enough. And all of that gets stored, not just in memory, but in the frequency you emit. You might walk into a room and immediately sense friction, not because anyone is acting outwardly aggressive, but because your field is carrying a subtle frequency of defense. You may engage with someone and misread their tone, not because they were being unclear, but because your internal lens was already tinted by previous unresolved interactions. In this way, your inner state becomes your outer filter. The good news is, this filter can be adjusted, not by changing the world, but by cleaning the lens. And cleaning the lens means slowing down enough to observe it. It means pausing the compulsion to think through everything, and instead, just noticing the thought arrive, pass, and disappear. Like clouds moving across the sky, they have no power unless you decide to build a house under one and live there. Many people fear that without constant thinking, they'll become careless or passive. But this fear is itself a thought. What actually happens when the noise recedes is the opposite. You become more aware, more responsive, more alive. You begin to hear the quiet guidance that was always there, buried beneath the commentary. You start to see the next step, not because you planned it, but because it reveals itself naturally when you're not crowding the space. And this is what begins to change the quality of your presence. not just internally, but in every interaction. People begin to respond differently, not because you're trying to impress them, but because they can feel that you're no longer broadcasting anxiety or self-doubt or masked urgency. You've started transmitting coherence. You've become a stable point in an otherwise chaotic environment. And people feel that, and they may not know why, but they sense the shift. You no longer pull from desperation. You move from alignment. Your actions come from clarity rather than reactivity. You're not rushing to fix yourself or prove yourself or earn peace. You're grounded in it. And from that groundedness, your energy attracts situations, opportunities, and people who mirror that same frequency. This is where life begins to feel different. Not because you've changed everything on the outside, but because you've reclaimed your position on the inside. You've stopped being a puppet of old thought patterns and started being the conscious presence behind them. You've stopped living as if your inner world is something that happens to you and started recognizing that you shape it by where you place your attention. And attention, once reclaimed, is powerful. It's not passive, it's a living force. Where you place it determines what grows. When your attention is fused with fearful thoughts, fear expands. When it rests in presence, presence deepens. And every moment, you have the ability to notice where it's going and gently return it. This doesn't require dramatic effort. In fact, effort usually makes it harder. What it requires is consistency, a daily returning, a willingness to choose again and again. Even if you followed a thought for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, an hour, there's still the moment when you realize it, and in that realization, the entire momentum changes. You can come back over and over. That's the real practice. Not perfection, but return. Each return weakens the grip of overthinking. It reminds your system that thought is not the ruler. It's a passing wave. You don't need to ride every wave. You can let most pass without boarding. And the fewer you board, the calmer the sea becomes. The calmer the sea, the more you can see what's underneath. And what lies underneath is not confusion, but clarity. You'll begin to notice that you don't need to think about every decision to make a good one. That spontaneous insight often comes in moments of non-thinking, when space has been made for something new to land. That life doesn't need to be dissected at every turn to be meaningful. Sometimes the most significant realizations come when you're doing nothing at all, simply breathing, simply being. And being in its purest form is not boring, it's not inactive, it's rich, it's vibrant, it's alive in ways that overthinking could never replicate. It's where creativity comes from, where love arises without condition, where solutions appear without force. And once you've tasted this kind of clarity, you start to build your life around it, not as a strict discipline, but as a quiet devotion to what feels real. That realness becomes your compass. You no longer chase thoughts, hoping they'll lead you to peace. You pause and let peace find you. You no longer argue with your mind about what should or shouldn't be. You sit with what is, and in that stillness, you discover something truer than any mental story. You realize you're not broken. You're not behind. You're simply covered in noise that isn't yours. And beneath that noise, there's a rhythm that's always been guiding you. A rhythm that doesn't speak in words, but in feelings, nudges, senses. You don't need to manufacture it. You only need to make room for it. And room is made not by effort, but by subtraction. You subtract the noise. You subtract the identification. You subtract the habit of following every thought as if it were a map. You don't lose anything real when you stop overthinking. You lose confusion. You lose distortion. You lose the layers that prevent you from sensing the simplicity of the moment. And what remains is more than enough. What remains is the ground on which a stable, clear, and magnetic life can be built, not because you forced it, but because you aligned with it. And this alignment isn't a one-time thing. It's a posture, a choice, a practice of returning again and again, not with shame, not with pressure, but with presence. And presence, when lived fully, becomes the most transformative force you'll ever know. When the mind no longer dictates the tempo of your internal life, a remarkable shift unfolds, subtle at first, yet profound in its consequences. You begin to notice the sheer volume of space previously taken up by mental noise, projections, expectations, and endless internal commentary. In that space, something unfamiliar appears, a kind of quiet knowing, not information, not analysis. Just a settled sense of being where you're meant to be, without needing to name it, control it, or anticipate what comes next. This space isn't sterile. It doesn't strip you of thought or rob you of function. On the contrary, it enhances your capacity to respond, to feel, to choose from a place that isn't cluttered with old echoes. This inner quiet isn't about avoiding problems or hiding from life's complexity. It's about navigating through life without being submerged in unnecessary tension. It's about the difference between reacting to life and actually living it. In that clarity, the nature of thoughts begins to shift as well. They no longer arrive with the same gravity. They appear, yes, but they come like weather, passing clouds, not fixed structures. You start to see them not as instructions, but as possibilities, suggestions, fleeting fragments of information rather than the final word on who you are or what reality means. And this relationship shift from participant to observer, from servant to witness, is what reclaims your sovereignty. Energy, as always, follows focus. When your focus has been hijacked by thought loops and compulsive inner dialogue, your energy gets pulled into false urgencies, misplaced efforts, and chronic resistance. But when that focus is reclaimed and anchored in awareness, the energy reorganizes itself without needing to be directed. It begins to flow again, naturally, intelligently. Not because you commanded it to, but because you finally stopped interrupting it. And this is the point where things start to feel different, not just internally, but in your environment. Life around you begins to mirror this coherence. Events seem less chaotic. Interactions feel smoother. Decisions arrive without force. There's no longer a delay between knowing and moving. There's no friction between inner clarity and outer expression, and you begin to realize that much of what once felt heavy wasn't caused by life. It was caused by a field jammed with internal noise. The inner space you access now doesn't need to be explained or justified. You don't have to share it with anyone. You don't even have to name it. It's not for public display. It's simply the natural state that emerges when the system is no longer being flooded by unprocessed thought. And in this state, you reconnect with something ancient within you, an instinct that knows how to feel, how to move, how to listen without the mind interfering. You begin to recognize that peace isn't something to be attained. It's the default setting that becomes visible once all the accumulated static begins to dissolve. It was never gone. It was buried. And now, with each moment of presence, it reveals itself more fully, not as an achievement, but as your most natural alignment. With this alignment, your emotional responses change. You still feel, deeply in fact, but your emotions aren't exaggerated by spiraling thoughts. You feel sadness without collapsing into despair. You feel anger without turning it into resentment. You experience joy without becoming afraid of its end. Emotions return to what they were always meant to be, messengers, not rulers. And it's here that the true impact of overthinking becomes clear, not just in the exhaustion it causes, but in how it hijacks your ability to experience emotion as it is, rather than what your mind tells you it means. When thought and emotion become fused, everything becomes distorted. A slight discomfort becomes a catastrophe. A passing fear becomes a narrative. A minor issue becomes a crisis that your mind rushes to solve, interpret, or bury. This entanglement between thought and emotion is one of the main reasons people feel overwhelmed. It isn't that life is too much, it's that the inner system is over-interpreting every signal, reacting to every mental flicker, bracing for every imaginary scenario. The nervous system, tied to the rhythm of your thoughts, responds as if each idea is a command. And over time, the body forgets what true rest feels like. Rest is not just a physical act. It's an energetic one. It's a state in which your system is not preparing, fixing, calculating, or projecting. It's where your breath returns to its full depth, where your muscles loosen, where your awareness expands beyond the mind's chatter, and most importantly, where your energy isn't leaking into false timelines or hypothetical futures. In this place, creativity flourishes. Not the forced creativity that comes from pressure and deadlines, but the organic kind that flows in when there's space. The ideas that arrive unannounced, the visions that form not because you sat down to create, but because you stopped crowding the room. When the mind gets out of the way, inspiration doesn't need an invitation. It enters through the open door. Clarity too begins to arrive more consistently. Not clarity born from over-analysis, but from direct perception. You see what's happening without the lens of assumption. You hear what's being said without preparing your reply. You feel what's true without having to explain it. This kind of clarity doesn't shout, it whispers. And only when the internal volume has been turned down enough can you hear it. And so you begin to realize your mind isn't broken. It isn't the enemy. It just got used to running the show. It took over because there was no awareness in the room to lead. But now that awareness has returned, the mind doesn't need to be silenced. It needs to be reseated, returned to its proper place. A helpful navigator, not the captain. This reseating happens not in grand gestures, but in small, consistent moments of recognition. You feel a familiar spiral begin, and instead of diving in, you pause. You sense the urge to react, and instead of obeying, you breathe. You notice a judgment forming, and instead of feeding it, you observe it. Each of these moments becomes a thread, and with enough threads, a new pattern is woven. A pattern where inner space is honored, where thoughts are noticed but not followed, where emotion is felt but not dramatized, where awareness stays steady even as circumstances change. And from this pattern, a new frequency begins to emanate, one that doesn't pull, doesn't push, doesn't plead. It simply resonates, and others feel it. The world responds. You'll notice it in how people look at you, how conversations unfold, how opportunities find you without effort. You'll sense it in the ease with which you move through tasks, in the peace you carry even when things are uncertain. This is not a performance, it's not a technique, it's not about appearing calm. It's about being empty of mental clutter. And that emptiness is not a void, it's a fullness that doesn't need more. A presence that doesn't seek constant stimulation. It's the place where you realize that most of your suffering wasn't about what was happening. It was about how your mind was interpreting it, looping it, resisting it, or projecting it. Remove the commentary, and what remains is manageable. Often, it's even beautiful. This transformation isn't mystical, it's practical. And it begins with the most unglamorous but powerful act of simply watching. Watching the mind move, watching the emotion rise, watching the urge to react, and choosing, in that space between impulse and action, to remain grounded in presence. Not because it's easy, but because it's real. This reality, the one that arises from presence, is not fragile. It doesn't fall apart under pressure. In fact, it thrives in intensity, because intensity no longer overwhelms it. When you're rooted in clarity, challenge doesn't derail you, it sharpens you. Emotion doesn't control you, it guides you. Uncertainty doesn't paralyze you, it activates your deeper awareness. And this awareness doesn't need to understand everything. It doesn't demand answers to feel secure. It simply observes. It knows the difference between what's arising and what's real, between what's being felt and what's being fed. And that distinction is what prevents you from falling into old loops, from collapsing into outdated patterns, from repeating cycles that no longer match who you've become. Because who you are is not defined by the thoughts you think. You are the one who sees them. And the one who sees doesn't need to control, fix, or suppress. It only needs to remain. And in that remaining, the system recalibrates. The energy field shifts, the nervous system softens, and you, the observer, become the most powerful presence in the room. Not because you're trying, but because you're no longer at war with yourself. And the world responds to this, not always instantly, but inevitably. Coherence has a gravity of its own. The more you align with it, the more you find yourself in the right places at the right time, with the right people, not because you calculated your way there, but because your vibration made it unavoidable. This is what it means to live from the inside out, to let your energy lead, to stop being a servant of thought and start being the curator of attention. And in doing so, you reclaim the most essential form of power. Not the power to control the world, but the power to meet it as it is, unshaken, undivided, present. The shift from mental chaos to inner clarity does not come in a single moment of insight. It comes in waves, a gradual unfolding, one layer peeling away after another until the landscape underneath, which was always there, begins to take form. You don't wake up suddenly transformed. You arrive moment by moment by choosing again and again not to return to the noise that once defined you. And in this choosing, something remarkable happens. You begin to notice how unnecessary so much of that noise was. How many of your thoughts were just reactions to imaginary fears. How many conversations you rehearsed for people who never asked for them. How many scenarios you tried to control in advance, as if anxiety could secure a better outcome. All of that effort, invisible as it was, came with a cost, not just in energy but in presence, in joy, in simplicity. Presence does not need to be earned. It does not ask for perfection, it asks for space. Space to breathe, to feel, to sense what's truly here rather than what might be. That space was never gone. It was merely covered. Thought after thought built walls around it. But now, one by one, those walls are being seen for what they are. Transparent, fragile, optional. Optional. That's the word most people forget when it comes to their thoughts. They believe every mental event is mandatory, that each thought must be considered, examined, entertained. But this is not true. Thoughts are proposals, not commands. They knock on the door. You decide whether to let them in. Most of the time they come from old places, childhood assumptions, cultural conditioning, emotional echoes. And just because they're loud doesn't mean they're right. Just because they're familiar doesn't mean they're useful. What determines their power is not their content, but your relationship to them. If you meet every thought with urgency, it will demand your full attention. If you meet it with neutrality, it weakens. This is not resistance, it's redirection. Not suppression, but sovereignty. You become the one who notices instead of the one who obeys. The one who observes instead of the one who performs. And the more often you choose this posture of awareness, the more your inner system stabilizes, not just mentally, but energetically. You begin to feel a steadiness that doesn't depend on things going well. It isn't shaken by inconvenience or change. It holds its shape because it's no longer molded by whatever thoughts pass through the mind. And this is what it means to move from identity to presence. When identity is built around thought, it becomes fragile. Every new idea, every disagreement, every shift in perspective becomes a threat. But when your sense of self is rooted in presence, not narrative, you no longer need your thoughts to defend you. You no longer use them as armor. You let them pass through without needing to hold on. And what remains is a self that's not constructed, but felt, not defended, but lived. This self doesn't speak in language. It doesn't arrive with slogans or philosophies. It exists in the quiet, in the moments between moments, in the breath you finally take when you stop bracing for life. You don't need to find it. You only need to stop looking in the noise. The noise has never held the answers. It only asks more questions. And that's the loop so many people get stuck in. They believe the solution to overthinking is more thinking, so they chase clarity through rumination. They try to outthink doubt. They analyze fear in hopes that it will vanish. But these tactics only strengthen the very patterns they seek to escape. You cannot quiet the mind by arguing with it. You can only quiet the mind by no longer needing it to guide you. This doesn't mean abandoning thought entirely. It means using it when needed and letting it rest when not. Just like the heart beats, the lungs breathe, the mind will think. But you don't interfere with your heartbeat. You don't narrate your breathing. So why treat every thought as a headline? Why insist on building stories around passing impulses? Letting go of overthinking is not about avoiding responsibility or floating through life in passivity. It's about engaging from a deeper place, one that isn't frantic, one that isn't desperate to fix or control, one that doesn't confuse mental tension for intelligence. True intelligence includes silence. True intelligence knows when to speak and when to pause, when to act and when to simply witness. And in this witness state, the body starts to recover. You may not notice it right away, but slowly, tension unravels, muscles loosen, digestion improves, sleep deepens. These are not coincidences. They are signals that the internal system is exiting survival mode, that the noise has stopped flooding your nervous system with alarms, that your body finally believes it's safe enough to rest, because overthinking is a form of alarm. It tells the system something's wrong, something's coming. Prepare. And even if nothing is actually happening, your biology reacts. It pumps stress hormones, it contracts, it shortens your breath, it narrows your vision. And when this becomes constant, you begin to live in a state that feels like danger even when you're surrounded by peace. That's what makes this transformation so vital. It's not philosophical, it's physiological, it's cellular. It affects your organs, your immune system, your posture, your voice. You speak differently when you're calm. You listen differently when you're not anticipating what's next. You love differently when your heart isn't guarded by layers of imagined injury. And yes, you will still have thoughts. Some of them will be unhelpful. Some will try to pull you back into the loop. That's not failure. It's just the echo of a long-practiced habit. What matters is not whether the thought appears, but whether you follow it, whether you hand it your attention like a gift, or simply acknowledge its presence and keep moving. It's that difference that sets the tone for your energy field. When attention flows to awareness instead of assumption, your field stabilizes. When you choose presence over projection, your frequency clears. You begin to carry yourself differently, not as someone trying to prove or explain or impress, but as someone who is simply present. And presence is powerful without effort. It commands respect without seeking it. This is the paradox of all deep inner work. The more you let go, the more solid you become. The less you try to define yourself with thoughts, the clearer your essence becomes to others. You don't need to explain your value. You emit it, not through arrogance, not through overcompensation, but through alignment. And alignment is what transforms everything, not through grand gestures, not through public announcements, but through the way you show up in small moments, the pause before you speak, the breath before you respond, the calm beneath your eyes, the steadiness in your walk. These are not traits you fake, they're symptoms of coherence, and coherence is contagious. You might notice others begin to shift in your presence, not because you told them to change, but because your energy made it feel possible, because you didn't contribute to the noise, because you didn't add more tension to the room, because you became a point of balance in a world that's always swinging, and you don't need to hold that balance perfectly. This isn't about purity or sainthood, it's about remembering, returning, reconnecting, again and again. Each time you catch yourself spiraling and choose to pause, you strengthen that muscle. Each time you disengage from a familiar loop, you reinforce a new pattern, and eventually that new pattern becomes your default. That's how real change occurs. Not all at once, but moment by moment. Quietly, patiently. Through repetition, not force. Through awareness, not strategy. Through space, not pressure. And in that space, you begin to feel who you are underneath all the doing, all the explaining, all the performing. You feel what's always been there. A stable, aware presence that doesn't need to chase clarity, because it is clarity. And from that clarity, life feels different. Not because it's suddenly perfect, but because you are no longer tangled in its imperfections. You meet difficulty with breath, not panic. You meet uncertainty with curiosity, not control. You meet yourself with kindness, not criticism. And this meeting, this presence, becomes the foundation for everything else. You no longer seek validation through productivity. You don't measure your worth by the number of tasks completed or the complexity of your thoughts. You find value in being, in witnessing, in responding from a place that doesn't require external confirmation. This kind of self-respect cannot be taken. It can only be forgotten. And now, remembered. The path forward is not about becoming someone new. It's about shedding what you're not. And that shedding doesn't need to be dramatic. It can be gentle, a slow release of what no longer fits, a quiet refusal to carry what was never yours. And with each release, you make room for more clarity, more simplicity, more coherence. This clarity brings choice, real choice, not the illusion of freedom that comes from reacting to every thought, but the actual freedom of seeing clearly and responding consciously. You choose what to feed. You choose what to follow. You choose what kind of energy you want to move through the world with. And these choices, though small, shape everything. The mind will still speak, but now you decide whether to listen. The world will still spin, but now you're not spinning with it. You're rooted, grounded, not passive, not numb, just no longer fractured, no longer hijacked by every inner voice that demands attention. And from this grounding, your energy field begins to resonate differently. It's not chaotic, it's not reactive, it's stable, magnetic, clear, and others feel it. Life responds to it, not because you forced it to, but because coherence attracts coherence, because reality reflects back the state you carry within. So the question is not how do I fix myself? The question is, what am I feeding? What am I following? What am I ready to release? And in those answers lies your transformation, not as a goal, but as a return, not as a chase, but as a homecoming. The mind has served many roles, protector, interpreter, narrator, but it's time for it to rest, to take its rightful place, not at the center of your experience, but as a tool to be used wisely and set down when no longer needed. And in the space that remains, you'll find something far more trustworthy: presence. Presence doesn't need credentials. It doesn't ask for applause. It doesn't need to be explained. It just is. And when you start to live from that place, life starts to arrange itself around that frequency. You no longer chase flow. It finds you. You no longer seek peace. You live in it. Not all the time, not perfectly, but steadily, honestly, and clearly. That's all this process ever asked of you. Not perfection, not purity, just awareness, just the willingness to return, again and again, to the quiet place beneath the noise, where you are not your thoughts, you are not your fears, you are not your past. You are the space that holds it all and chooses what to keep, and that is enough.